You already know something that most people around you don't realize they're missing. Not because you read more, not because you follow the news more closely, but because you've been alive long enough to watch this before. The headlines about Iran, the talk of escalating conflict, the word WW3 showing up in every third conversation. Younger people are treating this like breaking news. You recognize it as something else entirely. There's a reason experienced men go quiet when this topic comes up. Not out of indifference, not out of denial, out of a kind of recognition that only comes from having already sat through cycles that looked almost exactly like this one. And that recognition carries 5 very specific things inside it. 5 things they genuinely haven't had time to learn yet. The last one, the 5th, is the one most people get completely backwards. Most people assume the men who've seen the most conflict are the ones carrying the heaviest fear. What a lifetime of watching actually teaches is the opposite. And understanding why changes how you carry yourself through everything that's happening right now. This is going to cover all 5. 1. They know that conflict cycles. They don't just happen. To a younger person, the tension building around Iran and the broader anxiety about a widening war feels unprecedented. It feels like a singular, escalating emergency. Like something new has been set in motion that the world has never had to navigate before. That feeling is understandable. It's also incomplete. Men who have lived through multiple decades of international tension recognize a rhythm, not a conspiracy, not a predetermined script. A rhythm, the way certain conditions in certain parts of the world tend to produce the same sequence of headlines, the same escalating language, the same public anxiety. And then, most of the time, the same gradual de-escalation that the media covers in far smaller font than the build-up. The build-up sells. The resolution is a quiet footnote. So the younger person, consuming news at the speed it's designed to be consumed, sees peak after peak. They never get the long view. They see each spike as a first spike. The man who's been watching this for 40, 50, 60 years has something different in his memory. He has the full shape. Not just the alarm, but the aftermath. Picture this. A man in his early 60s sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. The radio is on. The words coming through it are about Iran, about escalating tensions, about the possibility of a wider conflict. His adult son calls from across the country, voice tight with something close to panic. "Are you watching this? Do you think it's going to turn into something?" The older man pauses. Not because he doesn't know what to say, because he's been here before. He remembers a morning that felt almost identical, the same quality of alarm in the air, the same language, the same sense that this time was different. It wasn't. He tells his son, "I'm watching. I've been watching this kind of thing a long time. Let's see what the next few weeks actually bring." That steadiness isn't indifference. It isn't dismissal. It's a man who carries the full arc in his memory. Not just the spike, but what followed the spike. This doesn't mean every spike is harmless. Some of them weren't. Some of the moments that looked like the others turned into real and lasting damage. For real people, in real places. But knowing the cycle exists changes how you metabolize the fear. It doesn't eliminate the concern. It gives the concern its proper weight, rather than the inflated weight that continuous headline coverage tends to assign it. The practical rule here is simple. Before you let a headline decide how you feel for the rest of the day, ask yourself whether you've seen this particular configuration before. You probably have. What happened then is relevant data. But here's where it gets more specific, because knowing the cycle exists is only half of it. The second thing experience teaches is something about the nature of the alarm itself, about why the loudest moments are almost never the most dangerous ones, and why that distinction matters more than most people realize. 2. They know that the loudest moment is almost never the most dangerous one. There's an assumption that runs beneath most war coverage, that the louder things get, the closer they are to breaking. This is an intuitive assumption. It makes a certain kind of emotional sense. But experienced men have watched enough international crises play out to know that the loudest, most visible, most heavily covered moments of tension are often the ones that resolve without catastrophe. Here's why. When a conflict is truly, quietly, structurally moving toward something irreversible, it tends to move in ways that don't dominate the morning headline cycle. The diplomatic backchannels, the logistics, the conversations that don't happen in public. Those are where the real movement is. The loud moments, the provocative statements, the military posturing, the escalating rhetoric that gets everyone talking about WW3. Those are often part of a different kind of dynamic, a pressure release dynamic, a signaling dynamic, a face-saving dynamic. Not always, but often enough that the loudness of a moment is a genuinely poor predictor of its actual danger. Think about a specific ordinary version of this. Imagine two neighbors having a dispute. One of them shouts in the street, puts up a sign, calls everyone in the neighborhood. The other one quietly files a legal motion. Which neighbor is more likely to cause lasting damage? International behavior follows a version of the same logic. Loud visibility and real danger don't always move together. Younger people, consuming the loudest signal available, can't always separate those two things. They haven't watched enough cycles to know that the silence after the shouting is often where the story actually ends. There's a particular feeling that comes when one of these cycles finally goes quiet. Not relief, exactly. More like the slow deflation of something that had been taking up too much space. A crisis that dominated every conversation for weeks, then stopped without ceremony. No announcement, just the next thing. Most people move on without naming that feeling. But the man who's lived through enough of them starts to recognize it as a pattern in itself. The loudness was the story. The silence was always how it ended. And the cost of getting that wrong is not abstract. The man who can't separate loudness from actual danger starts adjusting his whole life to the volume. He stops sleeping well because the alarm stays on inside him. Even after the coverage has moved to something else, he withdraws from the people around him because everything feels contaminated by the background dread. He makes decisions about his plans, his finances, his energy, calibrated to the noise level, not the actual risk level. That is a real cost. And it compounds quietly, cycle after cycle, each new set of headlines pulling the same lever. The drain isn't dramatic, it's incremental, and most people don't notice it until the capacity to think clearly is already depleted. The practical rule: when something is loud enough to dominate every conversation, pay attention, but also step back. The noise is real. The noise is not always the measure of the risk, which opens something that the loudness conversation tends to obscure entirely. Something about what actually lives underneath the headlines, not as analysis, but as lived weight. Because there's a gap between knowing conflict as information and knowing it as texture. And that gap is the third thing on this list. 3. They know that war has a texture that headlines cannot carry. This one is harder to explain, and it's the one that creates the widest gap between the generations right now. When younger people talk about the possibility of war, about Iran, about escalating conflict, about WW3, they are almost entirely talking about an abstraction, a geopolitical event, a foreign policy outcome, something large and distant and hypothetical that exists primarily in the language of commentary and analysis. Men over 60 are often not working from an abstraction. They're working from texture. The texture of what it felt like to know someone who didn't come back. The texture of what families look like when they had to absorb that. The texture of what a community carries after it loses the people it sent away. That texture doesn't make it easier to think about war. In some ways, it makes it harder. But it also makes it impossible to engage with the topic purely as a headline, as a political outcome, as something interesting to have opinions about. There's a weight to lived proximity to conflict that changes the way you listen to this conversation. The younger person hears the possibility of a broader conflict in the region and processes it as information. He might even find it interesting, a conversation topic, something to form an opinion about. The man who grew up during a period when that kind of language had real, local, personal consequences hears it differently. Picture a family dinner. Someone at the table, in their 30s, well-read, informed, is walking through the geopolitics of the situation, the balance of interests involved, the probable outcomes, the strategic logic. The older man at the end of the table listens. He follows the reasoning. He doesn't interrupt. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he's thinking about a name, a specific face, someone from his neighborhood, or the street he grew up on, or his father's circle, someone who left and came back different, or didn't come back at all. He can't put that into the analytical framework being offered at the table. It doesn't fit. It isn't a data point. It is the thing that lives underneath the data points, and it changes how the words land, even when the words are technically accurate. He hears the human cost underneath the abstraction. He hears the part that doesn't get covered. This is not nostalgia. It is not dramatization. It is a form of knowledge that lives in the body, not just in the mind. And right now, in conversations about Iran and escalating global tension, that embodied knowledge is one of the rarest things in the room. The practical rule: when the conversation around you feels too abstract, too analytical, too divorced from what conflict actually produces, you're not wrong to feel that friction. Your experience is filling in what the abstraction leaves out. That is a form of understanding. Let it be one. And that understanding has a practical side, one that shows up not just in how you recognize the fear, but in how you respond to it. Because recognition and response are two different skills. The fourth thing on this list is about response, specifically the one that most people in the room aren't equipped to make. 4. They know the difference between preparing and panicking, and why it matters. Here is where the gap between the generations becomes almost visible in real time. Scroll through any comment section under a video about Iran, about WW3, about escalating regional conflict. You find two kinds of responses. Some people are spiraling, full worst-case scenario, stockpiling anxiety alongside whatever else they're stockpiling, convinced that the right response to uncertainty is maximum alertness at all times. Some people are dismissing everything entirely. It's all noise. Nothing will happen. It's always something. Both of these responses have something in common. Neither of them is actually useful. Men who've lived through genuine periods of international uncertainty, who watched wars start that weren't supposed to, and watched near wars end that seemed inevitable, tend to have a third response available to them. They prepare without panicking. This is a skill, and it is genuinely rare. Preparing without panicking means staying informed without letting information become a source of daily distress. It means taking reasonable precautions without reorganizing your entire life around a threat that may or may not materialize. It means keeping your emotional baseline steady enough that when you do need to respond, if something actually changes, you have the cognitive and emotional capacity to do it well. Panic spends that capacity in advance. It depletes the resource before the event. An older man who has watched conflicts come and go, who has held his concern without letting it become his whole psychological posture, that man is not indifferent. He is conserving. He's learned that sustained alarm is expensive, and that the cost comes out of things that matter more. His relationships, his sleep, his ability to think clearly, his sense of what's actually worth his attention. The everyday version of this looks simple. He reads the news at a specific time. He forms a view. He puts it down. He goes back to his day, not because the world doesn't matter, because he understands that absorbing and reabsorbing the same anxiety all day doesn't make him more informed. It just makes him less functional. Younger people, growing up in a media environment specifically designed to keep them anxious and engaged at all hours, haven't always had the chance to develop this skill. They weren't taught it. The system they grew up inside actively worked against it. The practical rule: your ability to put the news down is not avoidance, it is strategy. Sustained equanimity in the face of uncertainty is a form of strength, not a form of denial. But there is a fifth thing, the one this entire list has been building toward. Most people, if you told them what it is, would push back immediately. It runs against every instinct the news cycle is designed to produce. And it is the clearest evidence of what experience actually does to a person if they let it work. 5. They know that the men who've seen the most are almost never the most afraid, and understanding why is the most important thing on this list. This is the one that runs counter to everything most people assume. The intuition says the more you know about what war actually costs, the more afraid you should be, the more exposure you have, the more proximity. The more real your sense of what could happen, the more fear you should carry. Lived experience, again and again, suggests the opposite. The men who've sat with the longest memories, who carry the widest view of how these cycles move, what they produce, what they take, and how they end, tend to be the calmest people in the room when headlines like these come around. Not because they're numb, not because they've stopped caring, because they've had time to develop something that doesn't have a perfect name, but that functions like calibrated perspective. Calibrated perspective is not optimism. It doesn't say everything will be fine. It doesn't dismiss the genuine complexity of what's happening in the world right now. The real tensions involving Iran. The real questions about the direction of global conflict. The real possibility that things could move in serious directions. Calibrated perspective holds all of that, and it holds it without becoming the fear itself. Here's the mechanism underneath it. A younger person encountering these headlines has no reference point for how this ends. Every scenario is equally possible to them because they haven't watched the scenarios play out enough times to have a feel for the probabilities. When everything feels equally possible, the worst possible outcome naturally dominates. That's not a character flaw. It's a cognitive reality of operating with incomplete pattern data. An older man has the pattern data. Picture a specific kind of evening. The headlines have been building for weeks. Iran, escalating tensions. The word WWE in every other conversation. An older man sits in his living room. The television is on. He watches the coverage for a while. Not dismissively, but without the knot in his stomach that the people around him seem to be carrying. At some point he decides he's seen enough for the night. He turns it off. Not because he doesn't care. Because he's been through enough of these cycles to know that the next thing that actually matters won't announce itself with a breaking news alarm. It'll arrive quietly, and he'll be rested enough to recognize it when it does. That is what calibrated perspective looks like from the outside. A man who turns off the television, not in denial, in possession of something. That accumulated data doesn't make him arrogant about the future. It makes him less controlled by the most extreme version of it. And this is the thing worth holding on to right now, because the world is genuinely uncertain. Iran is a real and complex situation. The questions being asked about WW3 and broader global conflict are not absurd questions. The anxiety that younger people are carrying is real, and it comes from somewhere legitimate. But the response to that uncertainty is a choice, not a simple choice. Not a choice that erases the weight of what's happening, but a choice. And the men best equipped to make it wisely are the ones who have accumulated the most honest, direct experience with what happens after the fear. They've watched the fear run its course. They've watched the headlines come and go. They've watched what lasts and what doesn't. And from that watching, from that long, steady, unsentimental witnessing, they've built something that no amount of commentary or analysis can substitute for. They've built the ability to be present inside uncertainty without being consumed by it. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most valuable capacities a person can have in a world that will continue, reliably, to produce uncertainty. The practical rule here is the one that contains all the others. You don't need to explain your calm to anyone. You don't need to justify the fact that you've been here before. You don't need to perform the anxiety that the media environment is designed to draw out of you. Your experience is real information. Your pattern recognition is earned. Your steadiness, in the face of headlines that are genuinely trying to destabilize you, is not passivity. It is the result of having paid attention for a very long time. Most people watching the news right now are trying to figure out how afraid to be. You've already been through enough of these cycles to know that fear is not the same thing as awareness. That watching is not the same thing as worrying. That carrying concern, real, honest concern about a world that contains real and genuine risk, doesn't require you to carry it at full volume, all day, every day, as though the intensity of your anxiety were proof of your attention. You've seen what conflict actually costs. You've watched how these cycles move. You've held the weight of what the headlines leave out, and you've kept going. Not despite what you've learned, because of it. That's what younger people are still in the process of figuring out. And until they've had the time to accumulate what you've accumulated, the cycles, the patterns, the texture, the costs, the slow revelation of what actually matters, they're going to need people in the room who've already done that work. People who can be steady when the volume goes up. People who know the difference between a loud moment and a dangerous one. People who understand that the most useful thing you can offer right now is not more analysis. It's the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who has already been here and came out the other side knowing something real. You know 5 of those things now. You probably knew most of them before this started.